You're listening to Know It, Live It. I'm your host, Laura Breksa. Each week, I have an insightful conversation with a fascinating person who shares their life mission, determination, passion, principle, or spiritual journey. Today, I'm talking to Wayne Bowen. I met Wayne in high school not too long ago. Wayne was on the academic track. I was not, and he has done our hometown very proud. You can look at his bio in the show notes to see all the nitty-gritty and the things he's done. I'm here to talk about his passion for education. Well, that's what we started to talk about, but we ended up talking about Stoicism and some other things, so stay tuned. It'll be an interesting conversation with a fascinating person. Wayne, you are an academic success. You have what I call brain grit. Now, when and how did you know learning in academia was going to be a big part of how you live?
So I started as a physics major at the University of Southern California. That did not work out. Within a couple of weeks, I changed first to political science and then to history. And it was kind of knew I loved history, but that was as far as it went. I was expecting to go active duty in the Army. I had an ROTC scholarship. In my sophomore year, I had a professor, Michael Robinson, in a Korean history class. The second class I took from him, and he took me aside and said, you're good at this. Have you thought about becoming a professor? You could travel the world. You get to be around young people. You get to write about whatever is of your interest. Think about it. And that was it for me. That was the only conversation I needed. And from then on, I didn't want to do anything except go on to get a Ph.D. and be a historian. And, my fields changed a little bit. Clearly, I didn't follow Asian history. But that moment, that conversation really set me on the path where I am today.
Did you ever think about doing anything other than being an educated person?
Well, I want to point out that I never wanted to be a teacher. My parents and then my grandparents and later my sister would all be teachers. And I decided early on I did not want to be in the classroom. I didn't want to be a teacher. I heard about all the struggles they had with kids who didn't want to be there and parents who made things difficult. And so I didn't want to be that. And so even for my first few years, once I finished my PhD and was in the classroom, I would argue with anyone who would call me a teacher. Like, I'm not a teacher, I'm a professor. There's a big difference. So for sure, that's something early on in my career that I differentiate. Now it doesn't bother me, it doesn't hurt my feelings. But certainly I've always loved learning about certain things. History, especially politics, government. Not really interested in learning about math. Still, I'm not interested in learning about math or anything particularly complicated in science, but definitely a fan of those disciplines. I'm glad they're there, but they're definitely not for me.
So is it the human drama of history that makes you interested in it? Is it the impact of one event that spirals into others? And what is it about history that is so fast? The interconnectedness? I mean, talk to me a little bit more about why it grabs your attention so much.
Sure. And, historians will often ask their students as they're thinking about research projects to have two questions in mind. One is it interesting to you? And then the second question is, so what? So you have to have the gee whiz factor, right? Like, this is a really cool story or a bizarre story or a weird story. That's something that'll get you reading and looking at the sources. But it has to say something else. It can't just be something weird. It has to be something weird that explains a broader context or can echo through other events and other things in history. So really, the gee whiz and the so what are the two questions. And so for me, I am interested in stories. I'm interested in tales that have not been told for a long time. History is current events, and so when it's happening, people are fully engaged in it. They know what the story is. They know who the main actors are. They know the significance, at least they think they do. But then as people leave government or they leave their roles or they die or the documents get locked away somewhere, we forget those stories. And so I think the role of a historian is to recover what's been lost and to try to tell the story as much as possible, recreating what it meant at the time. And so just to go a little bit beyond here, there's a curse that many historians try to discourage, and that's presentism. And that is looking at historical events through our perspective. In other words, judging historical actors based upon what we believe today.
Let me ask you, what are some of the obstacles you faced and what did you do with them on this journey?
Sure. No, I mean, so I'll say my 11th book is coming out, but I had plans for other books. I had ideas that I began to explore, began to look at, but sometimes the sources just aren't available. So, for example, there are times when documents are classified. This has been an issue occasionally when I've looked at World War II or Cold War topics. It can also be a question of language. So I have done some work on the 16th century. There's quite a bit of material in the 16th century that's in Latin or that's in German. And so is really inaccessible to me. So there's discussion lines and areas that were of interest to me I wasn't able to follow through. And even 16th century Spanish, I can fight my way through it, but it's a struggle. So at a certain point, I said, okay, I've read enough Inquisition trials. They're bad enough, but...
So one of the obstacles you have had to go through is actual documents and then reading the documents.
Right. And I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I mean, obviously, growing up in California, we learned a few words here and there, but I really didn't learn Spanish until I went to Spain. I had several years of the language. But it's one thing to learn how to say, hola, me llamo Paco, and then to actually, you work with archival materials in the context of, in this case, World War II, with a whole range of vocabulary that was not familiar to me. And so it took me several months of living in Spain to actually feel competent enough to understand the materials I was looking at and to be able to make some progress. And Spanish is really the only language that I feel comfortable working in. I can say a few words in Portuguese, a few words in Arabic, read a little bit of German, but it's not the same thing. Because obviously, as a historian, we want to be accurate with what we're looking at and interpreting. Foreign language is an area that can really be a burden. So yeah, it's definitely an issue. And then I'd also say that time is a factor. I mean, even though I've been able to go to Spain, I think 16 or 17 times now to do research, for a week or two at a time, to get an understanding of major historical events, it can take years to develop. And so what I've had to do is spend a week in Spain and then a couple of years go back for another week in Spain and then a couple of years later another week. And so can take me 2 or 3 decades sometimes to get enough time to move through some of these projects. So every book I've written, it's not as if I start at one year and finish at the next. These are years long as I look through the sources and try to find more material and find the time and the resources to get back to the archive.
So, and then you're overlapping other books in between.
Exactly. So I'm working on 2 or 3 books at a time, typically at various stages of production, which is, a fairly normal thing in the creative process. If you think about a musician, they'll often be performing one album as another one's being released and they're writing the songs for the third one. I mean, so it's the same thing for people working on, designing automobile engines or anything like that. It's not as if you're doing only one thing that will be done and then you have a blank slate. It's a cascade of efforts that will eventually come to fruition, but sometimes the timing is not up to you. So the book I just finished that's coming out this September on Spanish workers in Nazi Germany, I first thought about it in the 90s when I was doing some research in Spain. And so I was originally planning to do it earlier, but other projects got jumped ahead in line, essentially. It depends on, when the sources are available, when publishers are interested, and just when things line up.
So what was your first step? You said that someone put the idea in your mind to kind of switch to become an academic in history, but what was the first step you took toward that? Was it just switching to another class, switching a mindset? What was the first step you took?
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't thought of that. So after I had this conversation with Michael Robinson, and it just became clear to me this is what I wanted to do, I began to focus even more on history courses. So I didn't want to take anything else. I said, what's the minimum amount of everything else I can add to my schedule? And at one point, actually, I had to appeal for special permission to take more history classes because I had fulfilled all the degree requirements, but there were more I wanted to take. And so I kind of even snuck some history courses in as general education courses. And I dropped a minor that I had so I could take more history. So focused on that. And the image I've always had in my head is of the fiddler crab, which I'm sure you've seen. It's a normal crab, except has one really large, overdeveloped crab. And that's kind of how I view people who specialize, right? You can do one thing really well, but maybe not so good at the other stuff. So don't ask me to do differential equations. Don't ask me to fix a car, but man, I can write some books pretty well in the field of history. And I know what happened in Spain over, 1,000 years of their history.
Now, I know you've had 2 men who've impacted your success. Peter Hayes, Professor Emeritus of History and German at Northwestern University, and Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor who wrote The Meditations, which is a book of Stoic philosophy. Tell me more about the impact they've had on your life.
Well, I mentioned Dr. Robinson, who's the first who inspired me to go on and study history. But then when I got to graduate school, Peter Hayes was my advisor. He's a world-renowned expert on the history of big business and Nazi Germany. He wrote a groundbreaking work on IG Farben, which is the company that not only produced Bayer aspirin, but also Zyklon B, the chemical used to kill Jews at Auschwitz and other death camps. But I was just inspired by him because not only was it he's this impressive scholar who was looked to globally for his research, he was just a dynamic classroom instructor. His classes were always filled with waiting lists. People would make a special point to come to his lectures because they were so compelling and so well crafted. And I was his TA for a couple classes, and obviously he guided me through my graduate work. But he was very supportive but demanding at the same time. And I remember one class from him, I got a B plus on a paper, and he just wrote on it, "disappointing." And it was the most crushing and fair evaluation I've gotten in a long time. And it was such an encouragement to me to do better, to not disappoint him the next time, to, make the next thing I turned in for him just to be impressive. I have stayed in contact with him all these years. He was a reference for me as I moved from academic jobs. I referred to him for advice, and it's actually kind of a nice return because I'm finally writing a book really on Nazi economic history in relation to Spain, this next book. And so, I acknowledge him in the front of the book because of how supportive he was over these decades. So great mentor. Could not have asked for a better grad school advisor. And then, obviously, I never met Marcus Aurelius, other than through his books and through appearances in Gladiator and other fictionalized versions. But I just find it in Stoic philosophy very a resonant set of encouragements and thoughts. And I wouldn't call myself a Stoic for sure, but I find it to be a very comprehensive worldview that, even though it dates from the ancient Greeks and Romans, still has a lot to speak to today. There's a popular writer, Ryan Holiday, who's really played a large role in reviving Stoicism. He's written, a couple of books that have kind of popularized these ideas. He runs a bookstore that sells a lot of Stoic works. He's been a lecturer and so on. So I would never presume to claim I know Marcus Aurelius, but certainly I've been inspired by him.
Okay, and my question about Marcus Aurelius. I'm not being silly or debating because I really want to know. There is a quote: "The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts." Are you familiar with that quote?
It definitely sounds like Marcus Aurelius. I mean, he would say, and other Stoics would say, you can't control the world. You can't control the events that come into your life. You can't control other people. In fact, you can't even control your own body. I mean, yes, you can take care of it as best you can, but all of us are vulnerable at any moment to our bodies being against our best intentions, something that as I get older, I certainly I don't want to say it, but it's a motto, but there's a saying that resonates with Stoics and throughout the world, mementi mori, the idea that remember that you will die. In fact, I don't know if you're a horror movie fan, I happen to be one. But the recent hit movie, 28 Years Later, zombie movie, there is a scene, actually a number of scenes, that discuss this phrase, mementi mori, remember that you will die. And so I think Marcus Aurelius would say, be humble, live every day as if it's your last, because at some point that will be true. Everyone has a finite amount of time on this planet.
We do. So when he talked about the happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts, I wondered if you knew, or what does that mean by quality of your thoughts? That's what I was going to ask about.
So I kind of got off track here, from the original answer, but you don't control anything except your thoughts, and you only control your response to what the world throws at you, or even what your body throws at you. And so that's the choices you make. You can be angry, you can be furious, you can be sad, you can be depressed, based on the same events in your life. So you can have a delicious meal and be sad because you'll never eat that well again, or be angry because other people don't eat the same food that day. Or you can be happy in that moment and move on to the rest of your life, to things that matter more. And so you can also crave and desire that meal again and again. And so it gets reacting to the same event in your life. You decide how your mind will react to things. In fact, your mind is the only thing you control. I think that's kind of what he means here. And it's, there's a freedom in that liberation, the idea that you shouldn't be frustrated at the world not obeying your commands, because you shouldn't expect it to. Use your reason to understand your role in the world.
Your commands could be wrong. Then you're responsible too. But something that you're saying in there about other people, what do you think? I want to get onto your new book, but just on this topic and talking about learning and academia and being a professor, how does pursuing a formal education impact the quality of your thoughts?
Well, I think there's significant amount of evidence that formal education, certainly not just high school, but through college, tends to improve material outcomes. I mean, people who graduate from college, by and large, have much greater earning potential, much longer lives, much better health outcomes. But also, and I've seen multiple studies and surveys, also happier lives. And I think a reason for that is not just because they have had to benefit materially, but because I think a formal education gives people a context for understanding themselves in the world. And perhaps to realize that, for example, if you look at history or literature, you can see that we're living in, at least in the West, in an unparalleled time of prosperity and peace. And so if you think about just how much better it is to be alive today than it would have been 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that's a perspective that hopefully can make people understand and be grateful for the things that they have. I think it can also, understanding of where civilization has come from, gives people an understanding of the rapidity of change. And so it gives them an opportunity to be prepared for dramatic changes in the workforce, dramatic changes in culture and society, and not to resist and be angry at things that they expected would be there forever. I think it also literally prepares people for change, because students who we have who learn how to communicate, how to think, how to do a wide range of things are more prepared if their jobs go away, are more prepared if their industry transforms, are more prepared just to adapt and adjust to what the world brings at them. And it's not to say that you can't achieve those things through other means, but it's much more difficult. I mean, literally, when you come to university, you will take courses in general education. People like me who don't like math, I have to take math, I have to take science, right? And so you get a little bit of a lot, which means that when you move into the workforce or into graduate study, you have a little bit of a lot prepared for a whole range of opportunities and adjustments that the world will throw at you. And so yeah, I think the argument, even in today's context where there's been a rapid decline in respect for higher education or support for students going on to college, I think that the evidence is still clear that it benefits most people to pursue higher education. It doesn't have to be at the university level. It can be at a state or community college. It can be a technical area. But certainly the broader the basis, the more likely that those people will be prepared for a world that does not sit still for us.
I like that quote. I'm going to highlight that quote. I like that quote. Now I want to really ask you about this new book, Saudi Arabia. History of Saudi Arabia, the third edition published by Bloomsbury, starts the history of Saudi Arabia with the goings-on of the modern Saudi Arabia. Tell me about that choice to start the history of modern times. And I want to know about what is it with Saudi Arabia that captures our imagination, yet I'm going to go with I'm not the only one that's so ignorant about its reality. So tell me about those two things. And then whatever else you want to tell me about Saudi Arabia.
Sure. So the third edition came out of a trip, actually two trips I was able to take in late 2020, early 2021 to Saudi Arabia. It was supposed to be for a documentary on the history of the country. The documentary ended up not being finished for a variety of reasons. But it was a great opportunity for me to see the transformations that had taken place. I mean, when I wrote the first edition that came out in 2008, historians, tourists could not go to Saudi Arabia unless they had a business reason to do so, or were on a pilgrimage to the Hajj, which meant they were Muslims. So even though I was a little reluctant originally to write the first edition, again, I could say, look, no one else can go there anyway, so why shouldn't I write this textbook? But this latest edition, it was a real exciting opportunity because having gone to Saudi Arabia, I could see the changes that had taken place. I went into a shopping mall and saw almost no woman under 30 was wearing a veil, and almost every woman over 30 was wearing a veil. It had been lifted as a requirement in 2019 by the kingdom. But you can just see in that generational moment the changes that were taking place in the kingdom. The textbook is about the history of Arabia, and I go back to the beginning of civilizations, the Nabateans, who most famously known for Petra, but who built a kingdom based on water and trade in a history of the region, most of which is built on warfare. And so there's just these interesting stories in the history of Saudi Arabia. And then to go there in the moment at which there's a crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who has this Vision 2030 to transform the country from no longer being reliant on oil to having a multidimensional economy, all sorts of other changes underway. I think it's a tremendously interesting place, and it's unlike anywhere else in the world. I mean, just of course, it's an absolute monarchy, but it's also a place that has never been under foreign occupation, that has never had a revolution, has never been ruled by a military dictator or a democratic system. And so it's so exceptional to the rest of the world, never having ruled or ruled anywhere else. So yeah, I think it's rising significance of the world. It's now in the top 10 tourist destinations, which would have been inconceivable even 10 years ago. Yeah, so I'm going on at length here, but I think it's an interesting story, interesting country, and historians should never predict the future, but I definitely think there's interesting things to come.
Why shouldn't historians predict the future if that sayings about history repeats itself?
Well, because our discipline is really good at predicting the past, right? So we can leave to the political scientists and the sociologists maybe looking a little bit forward, because when you try to look to the future, it's either guesswork or science fiction, and so clearly those are outside of our discipline.
Yeah, historians, sometimes you read some history and you think, oh, they've really filled in a lot of gaps with their own imaginations. They just can't possibly know that.
Yeah,
But
yeah, for
I
sure.
like the way
For
you're
sure.
thinking. You have to take what's context. And if there's holes, leave the holes. Is there wrong with having holes when you tell a story? Do you have to fill them in with what you think? And then sometimes people just keep telling a story without going to the original source. They just keep telling the story.
Yeah, no, I've seen it happen where one historian will say it's possible that, or maybe this happened, and then the next version by the next historian takes out the maybes and the possiblies and becomes fact, and that's where it can be concerning, because of course when I'm looking back through a historical period, I'm thinking what was he thinking? What could possibly be in his mind when it's not documented? And so it's tempting to say, oh, I'm sure what he had in mind was XYZ. Really, I don't know. It could have been the opposite, and we really can't always tell. We can't read meaning beyond what the documents say, but it can be tempting to do so.
Now, is it tempting to be like the one that comes up with something novel and new? Is that one of the temptations to fill in the gaps with the historian?
But yeah, and that can be dangerous. When I was a graduate student, first on my first trip over to Spain, and again, remember my Spanish was really bad at the beginning of the year I spent there. I was looking in a military archive on the Blue Division, or the División Azul, which was a unit of Spanish volunteers that fought on the Eastern Front in the German army during World War II. Interesting topic, hundreds of books written on it. But again, my Spanish was bad, but I began to find some documents on Waffen SS units that were deployed next to the Spanish units. And I'm thinking, maybe there's some war crimes going on here that people haven't revealed. Maybe there's some, maybe the Spaniards helped the SS. As it turns out, they were Belgian SS units. They had nothing to do with the war crimes in that area. I read the documents and actually found out later that the Spanish refused to go along with some of the harsher measures of the Eastern Front. They protected some local populations, including some Jews, along the way. But had I gone with the original story that I thought was there, based on my lack of understanding of the documents, that could have been not only wrong, but I think it would have led me down a really unproductive path as a historian. So yeah, we definitely have to avoid jumping to conclusions based on the first document we read, especially if we're not great in the language.
I think that's part of academia, isn't it? There's got to be humility with it. You got to be able to admit that you don't know, and that's why you keep studying and keep learning, which goes on with passion and principle of learning is you've got to be able to say, I don't know. Let me find out. I sent you a quote by Theodore Roosevelt called Men in the Arena, and you had some opinions about that. And I wanted to have you discuss that with me. I'm going to read the quote, Man in the Arena by Theodore Roosevelt. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. So his place shall never be without those cold and timid souls who neither knew no victory or defeat. Tell me about what you think about that quote.
Yeah, so great respect for Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, I think you'll look far and wide to find someone who accomplished so much, starting from such certainly a physically weak basis as a child. You know, he was sickly and overcame that. Unquestionably a person of courage and achievement. But I think this bias for action is something that can be a challenge to face up to as an objective. I mean, if anything, we've gone the other direction, that the idea that we should charge ahead, fully convinced of the merits of our position and refuse to stop for anything. You know, whatever your passion is, go for it. And don't stop no matter what it takes to achieve what you want. Well, sometimes perspective is important. Sometimes thought is important. You can want something more than anything else, but if you don't have the capacity to achieve it, you could waste your whole life. I think about, for example, young people who want to be movie stars, want to be actors. You could spend your whole life auditioning, practicing, paying for classes, getting a degree, and never become a movie star. That was your passion, but maybe you're not even good at acting. You could be driven into politics and believe that that's the place you want to achieve changes in the world, but your ideas could be wrong. You could be leading people down a destructive path and bring misery and suffering. I mean, it doesn't take long to find demagogues in history who have said, you know, follow me and we will achieve great things, and have led their people on to suffering and misery. And it's not to say that Teddy Roosevelt wasn't a successful leader. Clearly he was. He was, we can discuss his war record in the Spanish-American War, but nonetheless, he led with courage, organized the unit, fought against the Spanish, by all accounts, fought briefly but well. He had an electoral success, became president of the United States, but I'm not sure that the bias for action that he exhibited is a good example for everyone to follow. For example, if you're thinking about a military operation, you don't want to just attack the enemy with all of your energy and all of your capacity at the moment. You want to think, what is the most efficient way to defeat my enemy at the least cost to myself and my soldiers? That requires thought. And yes, in the end, in the last moment, it requires action. But 90% of the work is thought, is administration, is logistics, is preparation. The same thing with anything worth doing. Yes, the moment in which that actor steps out on the stage is action, and the director calls action before the film. But more than 90% of it takes place before that word action is said. And so I think again, great respect for Teddy Roosevelt. He's an inspiring president. People from the left and the right still cite him. He was Harry Truman's favorite role model among many role models. But I think the quote can be taken too far and extrapolated into a way of life that can lead to misery, suffering, and great disappointment.
I agree. I think there's a difference between living your passion and achieving a passion. I think there's a big difference. I think you can live your passion. You can't become everything. No one can become anything they want to be. I think that's a lie. I cannot become an NBA player, but I can learn everything there is to know about basketball. I can learn all the rules. I can love basketball.
So my role here is I receive appeals from students. So for example, if a student wants to change their major and they've gone beyond a certain number of credit hours, it has to be approved, right? So I'll get appeals to change majors into engineering from something that's not engineering. And the student will say, I've always been passionate about this. It's where my heart is. I really am excited about this. But they have C's and D's in math. They haven't been able to pass through the basics introductory courses that are required before you become an engineering major. And so you maybe love engineering, but you don't have the capacity. You have to have the heart for it, but then also the mind for it. You have to find something you love and that you're good at. And those two don't always line up, unfortunately. Now, with practice and hard work, you can improve your capacity. There's no question about that. So it's not as if it's set in stone. But just committing to something and staying with it forever after multiple failures may not always lead to the end that you expect.
Very true. And I agree with you that the critic does count because you do have to study failures.
Yeah, for sure. We don't learn from successes, we learn from our failures. I mean, I appreciate the chance to talk about what's gotten me to the place I am. I mean, history can be a very solitary discipline. So when I go to Spain, I'm in the archives for 10 or 11 hours a day by myself with the documents and the materials. And I think, when people enter into a discipline or a field, they have to think about not just the end of it, not just having books that you've written on a shelf, but what is the process to get to there? And are you prepared for that process? For someone who's extroverted, it can be suffering to be in an archive by yourself all day with no conversation except, yes, I would like the next book, please. But if I was to go into sales and marketing, I think having to engage fairly continuously with people all day as part of my work and people I don't know who are surprised to hear from me, that might be a challenging for me too. So I think more thinking about not necessarily the final element of a discipline or the final element of a field, standing on the stage, seeing the book on the shelf, but what is all the work required to get there? And is that where your passion is? Because that's where most of your time will be. Kind of gone off on a pathway here, but I think it relates to the questions you asked earlier.
I love it. And what part of the Army helped you in this process? Did you learn anything in the Army that you applied to following a path of education? Was it vice versa, or was it the same?
Yeah, I mean, my careers were parallel, gradually rising in responsibility in both. But I think what the military helped me to do was, in a sense, it led me into Stoicism. Because there's so much in the military that's outside of your control, as you rise in rank, or maybe especially as you rise in rank. So, for example, when I went to Iraq, I didn't get to control what had happened to the country before I got there. I didn't get to control how the Iraqis responded to what we did. I didn't get to control what happened above me, above my ranks. I didn't get to control the resources we had. So what within my span of control was I able to achieve? What can I actually accomplish? I think it was an appropriately humbling experience, but generally a positive one, and not just in Iraq. I think, also learning about other cultures. And one thing that we said quite a bit in Iraq was, inshallah, if God wills it. And it can mean a lot of different things. It can be described as a fatalistic response to life, that whatever happens, happens. But it can also be very liberating. You ordered the parts. And they'll get here, inshallah, if God wills it. And if they don't, we'll do something else. We'll adjust accordingly. Not feeling as if everything is going to happen as you planned it because you planned it. Because your plans only go so far and they have to interact with everyone else in the chain. And then we'll see what happens. So accepting the world as it is, at the same time hoping I can change it, I think those two things go together.
And you can't change history.
You can rediscover what's been lost. You can bring forth voices that have been forgotten, and you can explain why other historians have explained it incorrectly, and how the new sources have revealed something that really makes the story different.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bowen. I appreciate your time and meeting with me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Visit knowitliveit.net for the latest scoops, recaps, and more. Don't miss an episode with fascinating people who walk their talk.